Jazz musicians now are the closest thing that we have to Mozart, Beethoven, Haydn. Their whole approach of really deeply understanding a language and conversing in it with other musicians, that's what it was, and we've kind of lost that a little bit, I think. The moment you start thinking, it's game over.
Have you ever heard a classical musician improvise? Well, listen on and you will. Let me tell you, hearing someone take a theme from a Mozart concerto and then improvising on it in the style of Mozart is really quite amazing. Welcome back to another episode of On Music and Making with me, Jeremy. I'm a classical pianist and I talk to artists in the world of classical music doing great things about their stories and about their craft. In this episode, we have William Bracken, an incredible British concert pianist who is also a great friend of mine. Will has performed all around the world in prestigious venues such as Carnegie Hall, Barbican Hall, and the Liverpool Philharmonic Hall. But what makes Will truly stand out as a pianist is his expert ability to improvise, a skill and also a tradition that seems to have been lost in recent years. And by recent, I mean the last 100 years. Exposed to jazz and improvisation from an early age, Will discovered classical improvisation during COVID and kind of went down a rabbit hole from there on. He has since experimented with improvising in the classical tradition, following in the footsteps of pioneers such as David Dolan and also Robert Levin. He now teaches improvisation at the Center for Creative Performance and Classical Improvisation at the Guildhall School of Music and Drama. And his incorporation of improvisation in his performances have now extended to improvising complete cadenzas in Mozart concerti and also taking original themes from his audience and improvising, extemporizing on them into a full-blown piece of music, as you will see later on in the episode. It is something that completely blows my mind, even as a classical pianist myself. And I suppose that kind of begs the question, how much of ourselves are we not discovering by not trying this whole new aspect of improvising, of playing not to the text, but to just let ourselves be inspired and to be free and to unlock the subconscious in performance and in improvisation. We talked about the flow state and accessing the subconscious when on stage, something that doesn't just apply to piano playing but to everything you do in life, really. And we also talked about how classical music education nowadays is very much like a Frenchman reciting an English sonnet and then performing it on stage, being applauded for it without knowing what it actually means. To Will, learning to improvise is like learning a language and is learning how to communicate. And if we are to play something by Mozart, Haydn or Beethoven, then we should also learn to be able to communicate in that language. Talking to Will is always such an inspiration for me because he carries such a wealth of knowledge, but at the same time, he is so humbly curious about everything that's happening. He's always very eager to learn more and to absorb more. He's not afraid of getting out of his own comfort zone, which is something that I really admire. And in that way, he has become a much more interesting person and also a much more interesting artist. And I hope you will find what he has to say just as fascinating as I did. So sit back and be inspired by this episode of On Music and Making with William Bracken. Thanks, Will, for joining me today. Could you tell me a little bit now about how was your musical education like?
Well, the whole thing just seems to be an enormous streak of good luck, to be honest. I'm talking really about the teachers that I had,
Yeah.
That I just, they kind of fell into my lap in a strange way.
Mm-hmm.
So, my parents are musicians, as you know,
Yeah.
but, when I was a kid, it was always a game, it was nothing.
Were they both cellists?
Both cellists.
At the Royal Liverpool Philharmonic?
Royal Liverpool Phil, and they were studied at Guildhall as well.
Oh, okay.
So, it's a bit crazy. But and then I met this guy, Richard Merrick, who ran this Piano Man scholarship scheme, and he was just doing a masterclass in a school in Liverpool, and I was in like year 7 or something at the time, about 11 years old.
Piano Man.
Yeah, Piano Man.
Love the name.
Yeah, because it used to be sponsored by the Blue Man Group, so that's how the title came. Right. So Richard came and did this masterclass, and he was wonderful and charismatic and full of energy, and slightly bonkers, but great. So I was chosen to do that, which was I was very fortunate. He was wonderful, and then a few years couple of years after that, I auditioned for the junior RNCM, got put with Jonathan Middleton by the amazing head of the school, Karen Humphreys, who was so sensitive to students' needs, and Jonathan was just absolutely the right person for me at that time. And he gave me a really strong technical foundation, and I just remember like leaving the lesson and already be looking forward to the one next week, and I would be looking forward to it all week. It was just an absolute highlight, and the whole day at junior RNCM was great. It's where I got into doing jazz more seriously than before. So I had my jazz quartet. I would play every week and write stuff and bring it and play in the jazz band as well.
So you've been steeped in jazz and classical from quite a young age then?
Yeah, so, well, actually, it was my first sort of piano inspiration was this guy in like my youth orchestra when I was about 8 or something.
Okay.
And this trumpet player, he was just playing boogie-woogie piano. And I was like, that's so cool. And I wanted to do it immediately. So that was like the first thing that I remember being like really inspired, and I was like, wow, okay, I want to do this, Before it was just kind of piano lessons, like whatever, And then later on, went on to jazz at the juniors. And then for the last 2 years, it was joint first study. And then went to Guildhall, did second study for a couple of years.
So you could have been a jazz pianist?
Well, yeah, I don't know. Sometimes I think about that. I remember going to the basement jams in my first year and hearing those guys who like come out of the Purcell jazz department and being like blown away. Like, wow, So that was cool. But yeah, now I've just kind of come around to getting back into jazz, which is wonderful, and I'm very intent on making it a larger part of my general musical activities. Yeah.
And what was it like having musicians as parents? Like, were they very free in whether or not you wanted to play the piano, or did you absorb a lot of different musical influences when you were young, or was it mostly like classical focused, and then you decided, okay, jazz was fun or cool when you were older?
Yeah, I mean, my parents were very chill with things, to be honest. I mean, there was always music in the house. I think I'm just lucky that they did such a good job. There was never any pressure, but they obviously knew the ins and outs of the business. And yeah, when I was a kid, my dad would put Frank Sinatra on and Beatles and, all this kind of stuff, and David Bowie and Elton John and all these people, So I got to know a range of different kinds of music. And then I remember actually coming home from a lesson with Richard and telling my mum that I wanted to be a concert pianist. I think she was quite horrified because she knew, how difficult it is, and the challenges involved and the uncertainty and everything. She was like, "Are you sure? Are you sure you want to do this?" But then after that, they were always just completely supportive, and I learned a lot of very important lessons, from my parents. I remember particularly my dad, when I would be sort of practicing till late into the night, and he would always come in and save me from myself. He'd be like, you need to chill out, and when I would be sort of worrying about other kids who I would see on the internet, who were doing amazing, playing really difficult pieces and all this kind of stuff, and I'd be like, oh, I can't do it, I can't do that, these kids are doing it. He would always say, just focus on yourself,
Oh,
that's the most important thing. And that's like one of the best pieces of advice I've ever received. I still come back to it every day.
I mean, it probably, having grown up in a musical family, you probably wouldn't be able to know otherwise. But do you feel like that from the get-go you already felt that music wasn't somehow just a career but something more, or let's say that you were able to see that there's more to it than just the conventional path most people seem to see about a classical pianist or a concert pianist?
Yeah, it's hard to say really, because as you say, I don't know anything else other than that. But I think I just learned a lot, maybe subconsciously as well, through just being around them and their colleagues. And I think something that I maybe observed from people who aren't musicians, who sometimes there's an assumption that musicians are kind of operating on this higher sphere and it's all very mystical and airy-fairy, but we're just normal people.
Yeah.
We're just doing our job. Of course it's something profound and special without question, but at the same time, here we are, we're friends. We're sitting here, you know,
Having tea.
Yeah,
chatting.
I think it's a you know, a relatable experience, to be honest.
Yeah, this is just a break from practice.
Yeah.
I'm a little bit curious, since you were brought up in a British educational system, but you were brought up in a normal school. You just went to Saturday schools where you had music lessons. So
Yeah.
you were, I guess you were brought up in a conventional way.
Yeah.
It seems to me that British pianists, one thing that kind of characterizes them is like their intellectual curiosity more than anything, I would say.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I think about Stephen Huff, who plays, of course, Rachmaninoff and Schumann, but also does his own transcriptions.
Yeah.
And I think about Peter Donahoe, who is just like playing so many different composers, and or Stephen Osborne, who is this like creative mind in programming and everything. Do you think like there is something that characterizes British musical education in a way?
Yeah, I've heard the argument that you're suggesting before, and it's a generalization, I think. You know, it's really depends on the person, you know. And I don't have much experience of studying in other places, you know. I did Aspen, that was my one foray basically into the American system, you know, a very small glimpse.
Yeah.
And, you know, I've studied with various teachers in Europe, but nothing, not a course, so it's hard to compare really.
But I think, well, I grew up in Asia, and I know that a lot of kids are pushed to exams and competitions, and you know, when you're young and you like music and you're good at the piano, that seems to be like a natural way. Whereas I feel like here there's a lot more opportunities about, you know, it's more about performing. You know, if you're good at the piano, then there's this concert series that you can perform in, or you know, the local church is doing like something like, it's more about like sharing rather than...
Yeah, well, I mean, that's, I hope that's true.
Yeah.
You know, I think again it depends on the person and their situation, but you know, also you have to rely, when you're a kid, you have to rely on, you know, responsible and experienced mentors to guide you through these things, you know. For example, I had always teachers saying, you know, don't worry about competitions so much when I was a teenager, you know. Say, just focus on your playing, focus on improving. You know, if a lot of the time these people who win big competitions when they're very young, suddenly they're plunged into the limelight, they have 100 concerts in their diary. Yeah. And then it's the pressure come out of nowhere, you know, which I certainly wouldn't have been able to handle. I think the way my life has gone so far, everything has been very gradual. And I'm grateful for that, to be honest, you know.
Would you say it aligns, what you're doing now aligns very well with
what I imagined? Yeah, I mean, you know, I imagined playing in Carnegie Hall, Concerto. You know.
Did play in Carnegie Hall.
I did. It's not every day you get to do that.
Yeah, it's just a different route, I guess. But
yeah,
you still did.
mean, yeah, I think my priorities changed. You know, when I was a kid, I was more interested in playing loads of notes really fast, and you know, doing all the cool stuff in inverted commas. And then when I went to college, it became more about fulfillment and artistic expression and you know, imagination and different things. And I think also that aligned with a shift in the career focus. So I was less focused about sort of having maybe a kind of conventional success rather than achieving something in my playing that I thought was you know, of a level that I aspire to, you know.
Why was that? Did someone inspire you particularly?
I think that came up from, I started listening a lot more to recordings. I started being a lot more curious about pianists when I was in my 20s. And I think that was definitely a big thing, you know, hearing all these incredible recording, you know, the ones from the 20th century, you know, Rachmaninoff and Mozart and Horowitz and Jan Pogorelic and all these people that were just, you know, so inspiring, you know, time and time again. And those were the things that made me aspire to, you know, try and do something like that, you know.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of, for me, that's what characterizes you, is this always And it reflects in your playing, I think. There's always searching for different things, anything that interests you, rather than feeling like you have to perfect what you already have.
Yes.
It feels to me you're always trying to look for more interesting things to do, you know, whether it be like embellishing a sonata to actually improvising cadenzas, sitting higher or lower at the piano. You know, all these things, I think it's what makes you a very interesting pianist. And now you're combining jazz and classical music together. So let's talk a little bit about improvising classical music. Because now you are the assistant professor of the, what is it? The Center for...
Member of teaching staff in...
Member of teaching staff at the Guildhall School of Music. And, well, according to your profile, it says that you are at the Center for Creative Performance and Classical Improvisation.
That's it, yeah.
So what is that?
It's a department which was set up by David Dolan, who you know, who is a world-leading pedagogue in classical improvisation and also scientific research into the now officially scientifically recognised improvisational state of mind. And
scientific research?
Yeah. So this is with a team of neurologists in London who, you know, hooked audience and performers up to these, you know, brain reading machines and found that there was a enhanced, you know, kind of collective consciousness when entering into this creative mindset, you know. So it's fascinating. And he set up this department, and I studied in the department as a student and then became a member of teaching staff 2 or 3 years ago. And it's been great, enormously fulfilling.
How did that first begin? Did you have a break from improvising in jazz and then suddenly found out about this, or?
Well, we had these classes with David in second year that were part of the course, just a small taster into classical improvisation and his method. But then it was in the lockdown, actually, that suddenly I had all this free time and it was a blank canvas and I was playing a Bach suite. And I think maybe by that time I'd also seen Robert Levin do his residency at Guildhall, and he totally blew my mind, you know. I'd never heard of him, and I saw him I remember the first thing was he was coaching a string quartet. Just the way he would talk about music and the understanding of the language and the, you know, the emotional content of what's going on was so inspiring.
So Robert Levin is this American pianist who pioneers in a historically informed way of improvising classical music.
Yes,
am I correct?
I mean, he's a scholar in most things musical and beyond, and a leading classical improviser, really, one of the real pioneers. A student of Nadia Boulanger, who gave him this incredible musical toolbox that he decided to go and have this creative approach to performance. Which was, you know, irresistible for me when I heard it for the first time.
So it's like you listening to Boogie Woogie on the piano when you're 12 again?
I was just like that, yeah. So then I just went and watched everything on YouTube of his, all the lectures, performances, everything. I just soaked it up. And then I got in touch with David during the lockdown, and he's very, very generous and with his time, and we worked together, and then I took the elective, and it just went from there, really.
Would you say that your experience with jazz improvisation helped, or would you say it was completely a new thing?
I suppose it must have helped.
Yeah.
I suppose the idea of classical improvisation didn't occur to me until I'd met David, at least not in the way that I see it now, you know. I think now there is a huge parallel between jazz and classical that I didn't see before.
Okay.
It's some elements are similar, you know. You have this learning of a stylistic language, at least in one particular approach of classical improvisation, you know, that you're learning by doing.
Yeah.
You know, you're learning this stylistic language from the inside out, and you're playing with it, you know. It's trial and error.
Yeah.
You're getting to understand the grammar and the syntax through actually doing it, you know. It's much less intellectual and more creative and spontaneous, you know.
Actually, could you, for someone who might not understand what this is, just broadly define what classical improvisation is?
That's a that's a tough ask. Well, I suppose it's exactly that. It's using the components of any particular musical language in order to create on the spot, you know. Like, let's take, for example, if we're talking about Robert Levin, you know, the Mozart language, which he has gone deep under the skin of, you know, completing Mozart works and with a huge knowledge of his output, you know. Then you start to see certain things crop up again and again, you know, certain chord progressions, certain turns of phrase. It's like maybe, or like if you have a friend who they say certain things that other people don't say, and you kind of pick up on it and then you impersonate them, you know. So you do the accent and then you say the little thing that they say. You can do the same with music, you know. Start to pick up on these little elements, but also you can go further and just draw from whatever is your association that comes to mind in the moment, you know.
So it's more than just improvising cadenzas or embellished repeats.
It's really what you make of it, you know. I mean, I still think whether you bring it to a public situation or not, it's going to deepen your musical understanding, and also not only just from a theoretical point of view, but actually there is something emotionally connected about improvising that, you know, what's your relationship to your instrument? How do you speak through the instrument, you know?
Yeah.
Improvisation kind of allows you to explore those questions and maybe find some answers, you know. So it's a hugely useful tool, you know.
When you first encountered this classical improvisation, it obviously must feel like a vast landscape to see Robert Levin do that. And you know, there's some very interesting videos on YouTube of him basically asking the audience for short themes, and then he links them together in a very Mozartian improvisation that is like extremely riveting and electrifying. But, you know, as someone who's never done it before, you probably saw that and you're like, how the hell are you gonna ever get there, right?
Yeah.
How did it like start? You know, where did you start with practicing or getting started with this?
Yeah, well, I suppose that it was when I was working on that Bach partita with David that I tried to do embellished repeats and interludes between the movements, you know. So it's not cadenzas, but it's a chunky starting point, you know. It's plenty to be getting on with. And, you know, Robert also says that in his masterclasses, you know, that he makes the point that you're saying, you know, you see someone who's been doing it for a few years and you say, well, how can I do that? You know, it's not possible, I can't do that. But actually, you know, you start to pick up on the little turns of phrase that crop up again, you know, steal things from other Bach pieces. You know, you find a perfect cadence in another Bach piece that has a different run in it, and you copy paste. You know, at first you just nick things, and then once you get used to that, then you start to find that these things have gone in. You know, they're there, and then you start. The next step is taking the leap of faith and trusting that something will come out. And there's always the scenario in which it doesn't work out. You know, but that's part of the game. That's the risk-taking element, you know. And in my experience, it's something that a live audience can really palpably sense, you know, that there is something at risk here. You know,
as if we don't take enough risks already.
Yeah, well, yeah. Fair enough.
No, but I completely understand what you mean. It's a different kind of risk, you know. I think as classical musicians, the risk we take is often the risk that we know, like, oh, how well have I memorized this piece? But it's not something spontaneous that everyone can kind of partake in.
Well, this is the thing that, you know, if you look at concerts in the 18th and 19th centuries, this is why people went to concerts, you know, because of the novelty and the fact that they knew they were going to hear something that they would never hear again. And they knew that things were being created right there and then. You know, all of the great composers would be asking the audience for themes and would be improvising on, you know, popular songs of the day, and this is what, you know, sold out concert halls and got people coming back. You know, it's a stark contrast to today.
Yeah.
So it's something that I'm trying to kind of reawaken this element of it being a living language. It's not a new phenomenon by any means at all. It's.
And I think it still is something that draws a lot of audience in. I'm thinking about Hayato Sumino, the pianist who got famous through his improvisations online, but also through getting really far in the Chopin competition.
Yeah.
And then now he just improvises his own cadenzas, things like that, on stage. Fazil Say, I don't know how.
Yeah.
He also does a lot of his own cadenzas and things like that. Do you think what you're doing is different from them, or do you try not to set too many boundaries?
I think it's different because I'm a different person.
Yeah.
I think the great thing about it is that there should be room for all of us. If every pianist or every musician is truly trying to find the most sincere version of themselves, then there will never be any standard. There'll never be any standard interpretation. Everything will be different and personal, and to me that's enough to make me want to hear everyone. It's like that's how we are. We're human beings. We're different.
Yeah.
I think that should ideally be reflected in music.
Have you found that your style has also changed or refined, your improvising style, or how it has affected the way you see music in general as well?
Yeah, I mean, definitely it was a big eye-opener for when we're talking about performing repertoire. Even I'm talking about not changing the text at all, but taking an improvisatory approach to how the text is played, because as we know, there is no one right way to do things. So it's a question of whether you plan exactly what you're going to do at every single cadence, at every single checkpoint, or whether you explore lots of different options in your practice and you go on stage and you do whatever feels natural to you in the moment. That's also improvisation. I think of Glenn Gould saying that he goes into the recording studio with 32 different interpretations in his head. I think that's one of the very exciting things to me about music, and that's a hallmark actually of my favorite pianists. Actually that you can always recognize them because their voice is so distinct, but you can never predict what they're going to do. There's always that element that leaves you feeling like a piece you've heard 1,000 times. You feel like you're hearing it for the first time.
It's the best.
It's just happening right there. I mean, that's the gold dust.
Yeah.
That's what we're after.
I remember listening to your Haydn when you were preparing for the Dudley competition. You played a Haydn in D major,
yes.
Haydn sonata.
Yes.
And well, I had no idea if you were improvising certain repeats, but it definitely felt like I was like not sure what's gonna happen. It has that kind of thing to it, and I think it does merge together. This once you start improvising as well, then what you don't improvise, the audience kind of thinks, is that improvisation? I'm not sure.
Yeah, I mean I take that as a huge compliment. So
yeah,
thank you. That's what I aim for.
Yeah, like take that for an example. I know it was a few years ago now, or last year. Was it last year? Yeah, it was last year. But like, did you have any stage in kind of getting that to something as high pressure as a competition of for a piece?
To be honest, I just kind of went for it. I was always warned by people, that maybe a lot of people would take offense at alterations of the text, which is, I can see how that could be the case. But then my feeling of conviction that it's the right thing to do kind of just overrided that, and more often than not, in fact, 90% of the time, I would say, it worked in my favour. People responded well to it. I'm talking about competition scenarios, which I think is a big change from 10, 20 years ago, I think musicians are becoming more open to this kind of approach, and I think that's a good thing.
And I do also think that 10 or 20 years ago, the idea of like staying true to a text means something different to what it is now as well.
Yes.
You
Well,
know,
there's
yeah.
the text and there's the spirit of the music, you know.
Yeah.
Because, as of course is pointed out by Robert on many occasions, you know, the fact that if you would play a fermata, which you would see in a modern text edition of a 6/4 chord going to the next thing, to Mozart himself, it would be unimaginable not to do something in the spur of the moment, to improvise a linking passage, you know. And the fact that there are now hundreds of recordings that exist of literal execution of the text, which don't take these things into consideration, you can argue that actually that is less faithful to the musical intention of the composer, because the whole ethos of that way of making music is to do with the spontaneous creation and also of the individual personality of the performer. You know, that was another big aspect that was part of this. You know, it shouldn't just be a way to, you know, spice up what's going on, but actually to show how you're unique as a musician.
There are two things I think about improvisations. Firstly, I'm really scared. And secondly, I don't think I'll be good enough. And I think those are things that a lot of people think about when it comes to improvisation. So, were you scared when you first started improvising?
Well, no, because I started doing it on my own in the practice room.
Yeah.
You know, I presume that some of your experience is informed by being on David's elective, where you have to sit there in a room with, you know, 4 or 5 of your peers and improvise on your own in front of them and a teacher. You know, that's terrifying.
Yeah.
That scared me. I don't know anyone who wasn't scared by that, you know. But I think the first step is to do it behind closed doors, you know, where there should be no risk. You know, if things go wrong, it doesn't matter, you know.
Yeah.
But I would think that would be the way to start, and gradually. I mean, it's not like you're starting from there and the goal point is to do it in front of 1,000 people. Not at all. You know, it's just a way of exploring this thing of playing your instrument. You know, I was going to say actually when I saw some of the questions, I was thinking that it kind of reminds me of, you know, the analogy with language. You know, if you think about playing your Chopin sonata as learning a Shakespeare sonnet or something like that, and let's say you're French, you know, and you learn this Shakespeare sonnet, you learn the sounds that the text makes, and you practice that, and you make sure you get all the right vowels and consonants in the right place, and then you go on stage and you recite the sonnet and everyone applauds and goes, wow, that's great. And then some English person comes up and goes, oh wow, I really thought that was great. And then the French person has no idea what they said, you know.
Yeah.
I kind of think that's like, if you put that in musical terms, what we're doing is we're learning the text and then we kind of regurgitate it.
Yeah.
But
You
then,
mean like in normal practice, like
in conventional approach to
yeah.
performing Western classical music. You know, we learn the text. You actually don't need to have any understanding of what's going on there in terms of the language of music, you know, the systematic, you know, linguistic quality of it. You just put the right sounds in the right places, and there you have the product, you know.
Yeah.
But then, you know, if someone were to play a question phrase to you, I think it would not be too much to ask that a professional musician would be able to answer, you know.
Because a jazz musician would.
Well, exactly.
Yeah.
That's the thing. Jazz musicians now are the closest thing that we have to Mozart, Beethoven, Haydn, you know.
You think?
Like, without question, their whole approach of really deeply understanding a language and conversing in it with other musicians, that's what it was, you know. And we've kind of lost that a little bit, I think.
Because nowadays we're taught, or a lot of young students would be taught how to read music, and then they would be given a Mozart sonata to learn.
Yes, well,
And
reading
then-
is the other thing, you know, which for me, I sometimes feel like a little bit of a fraud because my sight reading is not very good. And, you know, if you're saying, okay, well, I'm a professor of English at Oxford University, you would expect that they would be able to read English, write English, converse coherently in English, you know.
Yeah.
So if you then apply that to music.
So how would
You know.
you normally go about approaching a piece?
It varies really,
Yeah.
with varying levels of excitement or terror. The kind of audio side of my brain is stronger and more natural for me. So if I have a recording or an idea of how the piece should sound from an outside perspective, then that's a big start already. When I was a kid, I would get my mum to when I was doing grade 1 and 2, my mum with her grade 5 piano skills, she would play the piece, and then I would just listen to it and learn it that way. You know, not sort of copy it immediately like Mozart or something, but you know, take it bit by bit and listen and copy it. That was much more comfortable for me. I hated reading the music, always did, and was really reluctant to read the notes.
Yeah.
My teacher wanted me to do it, I couldn't do it. It just wasn't the way. But then later, you know, it became a necessity, so
Yeah.
I gave in at some point, you know. But everyone is different in this respect, you know.
Yeah, because I learn by not listening and just reading. Well, not as in I do play the music, but as in once I start learning a piece, I stop listening to recordings, and I try to just sight read. Well, my sight reading is okay, but yeah.
I suppose it's not so much a seeking out to listen to recordings in order to help me learn the piece.
Yeah.
But usually, let's say I just played now Chopin Third Ballade.
Yeah.
Okay, I've listened to it like thousands of times, you know, since I was a teenager. So I know how the piece goes, you know, I could sing it to you even though I hadn't learnt it. So it was already like memorized in inverted commas, you know, but then I had to match the physical learning of the piece itself to what I had in my head, you know, this kind of thing. So a lot of like standard repertoire pieces, this is how it is, you know, I've listened to it many times and then I'm kind of building on that. So that's like maybe the quickest way for me. And then obviously there's not everything I know that well by ear, you know, so you just have to do things in whatever way is the best and most appropriate.
Yeah. So you told me, you know, we kind of touched on the fact that how we learn music now is quite far from how how musicians used to interact with this musical language. So how did they used to interact? Like, you know, can you give me like a brief about what it was like back then?
Well, I mean, if you take Beethoven's concerts, for example, the first half would usually consist of compositions of his. The second half would be entirely comprised of improvisations. So those would be on maybe some of his own music that was popular, other popular tunes of the day, opera arias, this kind of thing, things that the audience would shout out, you know. And then it creates this atmosphere of the co-collaboration between the audience and the performer, that everyone is involved in the same thing and everyone is contributing, you know, not that this more modern phenomenon of the musician is raised up high on the stage and everyone else in the hall has to be dead silent and sit still and behave themselves, you know. Mm-hmm. This is very different from how things used to be, you know. And that's, as I said before, the reason that people would come to his concerts was not to hear the first half, but to hear the second half, where they were going to get something totally unique that would never be repeated, you know. And they were kind of circus performers, these people, you know. There's this famous story of Beethoven taking a fragment from a string quartet that was upside down on the music stand and creating this enormous fantasy from, you know, and Bach doing this crazy impossible fugue, you know.
The six voice one, right?
Yeah, they used to do all this kind of stuff, you know?
Yeah. And why do you think that is? And, you know, did they have certain skills that we are not taught nowadays as classical musicians?
I think it's largely to do with the demands of the profession that have changed. You know, classical musicians aren't required to do that kind of stuff now, really. You know, if you look at an A-list soloist, the job requirements are, you know, this amount of standard concertos, this couple of recital programs, this chamber music. If you can play that wonderfully well, that's it. You're hired. You know, there isn't the demand from the audience and the profession that there used to be for that kind of stuff, you know, because, you know, the world changes and people change, and that's just how things are, you know. But
do you think it's changing again? Do you think now?
Yeah, I sense that things are changing, you know, very slowly, very gradually. But I think a lot of people are hankering after a more creative approach to classical music than has been in the last 100 years, you know.
Have you any examples? I mean, apart from Robert Levin, or, you know, do you know of anyone who inspires you in this particular sort of way?
Well, for example, we just had at Guildhall Gabriela Montero. She came and did a session for the students of the improvisation course.
Oh, really? Oh, okay.
Yeah, which was wonderful. And, you know, it was funny because the first thing she said was, you know, often I get asked to come and do improvisation sessions, but I feel that I have nothing to say, because for her, it's not something that has been studied and worked on. It's just something that comes completely naturally, that she's done since she was a child, you know. So, and that also is reflected in her improvisation, you know, it just kind of comes out. It's remarkable, you know. So that's just another way, you know. And she often includes it in her concerts, you know, as an encore. She'll ask the audience for a theme on which to improvise, and off she goes, you know.
And again, I think that's something that sets her apart from other...
and it's why people go to her concerts as well. It's a selling point.
Yeah.
You know, to talk business as well as pleasure. You know, you're not gonna hear that every day or from anyone.
Yeah. You know, talking about improvising on stage, you obviously have done a lot more of that recently in your concerts as well. I don't want to say, like, has there ever been a flop, but, you know...
Well, the short answer is
has
yes.
that happened?
Yeah, I mean, you know, you just can never prepare for what will happen. And some things will always be more successful than others, and that's part of it, you know. And it's always a learning experience, you know. It's trial and error, you know. Since I started to include improvisation in my concerts, I've figured out what's the best thing to ask from audiences. First of all, that's something that you know, you can ask for a musical theme, you can ask for, you know, a bit of text or a song or a mood even, you know, and how many of those do you take and how long should you do it for, and all these kinds of questions. If we take the recent example of my playing Mozart K467, the Concerto, which has also cadenza in the first movement and the last movement. I think the last movement cadenza was more successful than the first movement. That's just what happened on the day, you know. But that was the first time I tried cadenzas in
What do you mean by more successful?
I think more musically coherent, and I was also aiming for a stylistically appropriate in the Mozart sense cadenza, which is not the only way to do it by any means, but that was what I set out to do in that particular concert.
Did you have anything prepared in case, you know, you weren't thinking of, like, how does one prepare to improvise? Well,
yeah, there was a process of preparation. So I would learn all of the thematic material of the concerto and be able to make sure I could play it in all the different keys.
Wait, what?
So, like, you know...
Oh, you can play all different keys.
I mean, I have it somewhere. Yeah. A book of manuscript, which I just wrote out all the little snippets of thematic material in the concerto. Just wrote it out one after the other.
Wow.
And then I would just play them each individually. And then maybe I would, when I was practicing, I'd say, okay, I'm going to put this, and then I'll do that, and then I'll do that. And then I'll try that, and then I'll go, okay, I'll start with this instead, and then I'll go to that. So it's just trying as many different things as possible, and crossing your fingers and hoping for the best.
Okay, I'm interested now. Can you give an example of it?
Of how
this
process
works? Yeah. Or like
okay.
Okay, so for anyone who's listening, Will is now at the piano, and I'm gonna ask him how improvising a cadenza in a Mozart. Well, which one we're talking about?
So let's do the K467 because
let's do 467.
That's in my ears. Yeah.
Okay, yeah, let's do that. So run me through the process.
So, like, you know, if you take, for example, the second subject. So we have this, okay, and then let's say if I'm in a practice session, then maybe I will try a bunch of different ways that could go. So you could have... Or let's say... etc. Or you could
Amazing.
have...
It's amazing. I can literally feel you hanging onto a note and then thinking, okay, let's try this new route. I can see it like in person. It's really exciting.
There's many different options to take, but you just have to keep exploring. So, for example, the last one I just tried would be much further outside the realm of what Mozart would have done, primarily because it modulated to a distant key, which Mozart never did in his cadenzas. So the first two I think I got away with, if we're talking about Mozart style. But, you know, I think the third option is also very interesting, and there are many ways in which to do this. And I go back to the element of one of the purposes of a cadenza being to show the personality and musical language of the individual player.
And when you do find something good, do you kind of write it down, or do you just think, no, I mean, you probably don't have to at this point, right?
Yeah, I think it's better to just try and do things by feel. And there is a slight danger that when you do something and you're like, wow, okay, that worked out nicely. And then you start going back to it and it gets stale, you know.
Yeah.
You just find yourself going there again and again. That actually gives you a bit more of a block, I find.
Yeah.
The best way to do it is to plan as little as possible, because the moment I think you start to say, okay, I'm going to do this and I'm going to do that, then when you get into the moment, in the heat of the battle, you know, you're operating in a different part of your brain, you know, the subconscious takes over. So the best thing to do, which is probably my thing that I need to develop the most, is letting the thing flow naturally, you know. The moment you start thinking, it's game over. So that's a big challenge of doing this kind of stuff. And for example, someone like Gabriela, that comes completely naturally to her. But I would say the more kind of compositional and analytical thinking comes more naturally to me. Yeah. And the letting the thing just flow is less natural for me. So I have to find ways to try and get myself into that frame of mind.
But I suppose also, you know, as you said, improvisation brings out your own personality as well.
Yes.
And
yeah, and the way to that is through the subconscious, you know. Which is the deepest part of yourself. You know?
Yeah. While I still have you at the piano, you can, like, if I gave you something, could you improvise? Well, I'm not going to give you any limitations, but I'll give you a theme.
Okay.
I'll give you a
This is an original theme.
Yeah. I'm also improvising now. It's going to be tonal.
Okay.
Do your magic.
That's it.
Yep.
to K467.
Yeah. I didn't
Couldn't get it out of my
my
head.
theme was so close to. I don't know if you made it sound like that, but now I'm thinking.
You did it, yeah. Or something, yeah.
Something like that. Wow. I think when I was listening to you just now, I was thinking a little bit about the flow state, because I think in classical improvisation you talk a lot about the flow state, right?
Mm-hmm.
What is that specifically?
Well, it's a different state of consciousness where you're, where the conscious thinking mind is disengaged and is kind of submissive to this deeper thing which is guiding the whole experience. You know, a lot of people often describe being in flow state as like being a kind of passenger, that you're not doing anything, it's just kind of happening to you, you know. And there's a great thing I saw Pat Metheny, the great jazz guitarist, saying is when he's at his best, and I think he's talking about flow state. He's saying, I think of myself as that I'm in the audience and I see this guitarist on stage and I hear the music and I think, what would I like that guitar player to play right now? And then he plays that. You know, it's like this out of body kind of state of awareness, you know, that you're another member of the audience, you know, and it's happening, you know.
Have you felt that when you were improvising?
Yeah.
How does it feel for you? Like that? Like,
yeah, it's hard to. It's like that. Yeah, I think that's the best way for me to describe it. It's like you're not doing anything.
Yeah.
But it's a funny balance, because sometimes I like to be doing things. You know, I like to be, or at least I feel that I am. I think actually in reality that's an illusion. I might feel like I'm reacting and responding to something consciously, but actually the decision has already been made, you know, in a matter of microseconds, you know.
Yeah.
When we go on stage and do these things, there's so much information that has to be processed that it's just impossible for you to think it. It's like how, you know, we couldn't consciously think about beating the heart and breathing, you know, and doing everything that the body needs to do. There has to be another part which takes control of that, and that's the same part that is in charge of things when we go on stage in an ideal situation.
Well, I kind of feel sometimes that I have achieved that, but obviously not through improvisation, but in my own performances sometimes when I'm like, I almost feel as if when I'm playing, you know, I'm playing a piece that I've learned for so many years, but suddenly I'm as if I'm recreating it anew on stage or something like that. I'm like even amazed at like the real-time decisions I'm making because of how it feels. Yeah. And it's as if you're accessing like a part of your brain that you just never turned on for the whole of your practice sessions over the years. Yeah. Or something, you know, something like that. Do you try to, you know, of course, improvisation, I think, unlocks that state a lot more, or a lot more frequently as well. Do you try to do something in your practice to kind of, you know, get this flowing all the time, if that makes sense? Yeah,
it's hard, to be honest. I think actually the secret is playing with other people. And to go back to jazz, that is their bread and butter. They're always playing in groups, because then you have to react. You have no choice, you know. And I find I enter a lot more easily into that state when I'm playing in a group. And luckily I have, you know, wonderful partners with which to improvise together. And someone will throw something at me and I will have to respond straight away. And there's an enormous amount of fun in that, and you just have to sort of think on your feet. And I try and bring that same mindset into when I'm doing it solo. It's much more difficult, I find.
I think it's much more difficult, you know, to start off improvising as a classical musician, and especially as a solo pianist. You're right, because there's a whole pressure of like having to create everything by yourself.
Yes, and no. I mean, there should be. Well, I think we spoke about this last time. You know, if you give a simple improvisational game to a small child, more often than not, they will just throw themselves at it with no fear, because they have much less, you know, self-consciousness when they're that age, and that actually is probably the biggest block to doing that. As you mentioned, there's a fear of playing a wrong note or doing something that's discordant, you know.
Yeah.
It's a very common thing, but you know, just to be able to play your instrument and just experience what's it like to play that instrument, what does it feel like, and learn by doing, as I say, that it's just something that you're feeling and exploring in the moment.
Yeah.
That's the way in, you know, and that's the feeling that I'm constantly trying to recreate. It's a playfulness, you know. It's this childlike thing. You know, people said it about Mozart, of course, and his personality, and also in the music making, that it's just completely whimsical, and I think that's why it's so effective a lot of the time, is because it plays into that, you know. He's just having fun, you know.
And now that you're actually teaching improvisation, how does that feel? Like, what do you notice about people, or?
Yeah, I mean, it's very, very fulfilling, I have to say, because you are addressing these things which often are much more fundamental than just the, you know, improvisation that we're working on in the class. It's to do with personal questions of, you know, applying pressure to oneself, and, you know, these kind of challenges that we deal with day to day as musicians, especially when we're studying, you know. So it's very nice to use improvisation as a tool to get people to, you know, open up and be more kind of kind to themselves. So when I see that happen, that's, you know, enormously positive to witness.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
So, you know, finally, what's coming for you? Like, do you have any goals in terms of improvising, or any projects coming up for you? Or, like, how do you see yourself taking this further?
I'd certainly like to do more concerto cadenzas, and I have this quartet that I play with, Ensemble Plus, and we play primarily improvised music. You know, we take themes from the audience and all this kind of stuff, and I hope we can get to do a lot more than what we're doing at the moment. It's kind of a tricky thing to get off the ground, because it's, you know, it's just unusual.
Yeah.
So I hope to do a lot more of that, and carry on including it in my concerts, and just kind of keep exploring at my own pace, you know, and hopefully also to teach more, because I think this should be, you know, it's very localized at Guildhall with David's department, but I hope to, you know, spread the gospel, as it were, and open more people's minds to the incredible, you know, opportunity that this kind of practice affords musicians.
Yeah. Well, amazing. Thank you so much. I mean, I asked you so many questions about improvisation in the past hour, but actually, I think what I've gained most is just by listening to you play, as always.
Thanks.
Thanks, Will. Thank you
pleasure.
so much. If you've enjoyed this episode of On Music and Making, please subscribe if you're on YouTube, and follow the show if you're on Spotify, to keep updated on inspiring and topical conversations about classical music with the people who make them. If you're interested in learning more about Will, I'll leave his website in the descriptions. I also did an interview with him on classical improvisation a while back, which was published on my Substack, so I'll leave a link to that if you're interested. Thank you very much for listening, and I'll see you in the next one.